Okay, so I think we're ready to go. Welcome everybody. My name is Chloe. I work here in the marketing team at Black Knight. So probably a lot of you guys have been on these webinars for the last couple of weeks. So this is our last webinar, a bonus webinar that we added. And just to say that we do welcome any feedback or any suggestions for any more webinars or anything like that. We are thinking about doing this again, so any feedback is welcomed and appreciated. So joining us on the webinar today is data protection expert Daragh O Brien. Daragh is the Managing Director of Castlebridge, who are experts in data privacy, information governance and information quality management. So today Daragh is going to give us a high-level presentation. So he's going to talk about things like data protection rules for doing business online, things to consider like cookies, analytics, understanding what data you need, what you need it for, what to ask for, things like that. So I guess the main focus of this webinar is to kind of get us all thinking strategically about our business and how we handle data. So the webinar will last maybe around 45 minutes, the same as we have done before. Quick presentation, maybe 25 minutes or so from Daragh, and then we'll answer any questions that anybody has at the end. So just as before, you can pop those questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens there. So with that, I'll hand you over to Daragh.
Thanks, Chloe. And welcome everybody this afternoon. I've been chopping and changing the slides a little bit since our rehearsal this morning, so I missed my own title slide out, but it's a good point to start here on our Dark Side of the Moon Pink Floyd ripoff slide. What we're going to talk about here today is that once you start doing business online, you're going to be getting data in different ways, and you need to be aware of certain rules that you need to consider in terms of what data you're using, how you're getting it, etc. And once you bring all that data in through what I call the strategy prism, you're looking at data protection obligations, data governance, which means understanding the rules and responsibilities and roles you set out in your organization, in your team for doing what with data, data quality, which is how good the data is it accurate, is it up to date, is it fit for purpose, not just for your own internal use, but also for what your customers see on your website about your company's products or services. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Metadata and master data management, they're all technical, nerdy, boring terms for the data that describes the data you have. So master data will be your customers and your products. The metadata will be the information you're capturing about those things. So if you're selling t-shirts, the metadata will be the size, the color, the availability, things like that. And then data security. We're going to touch on that very briefly today. It is something to be aware of. I'm going to talk about data security from a slightly different perspective than you might have heard about it in other contexts. Just thinking about the customer experience that you're setting up when you're doing business online, when you're engaging with your customers. Can we talk about the implications of Schrems 2? Yes, we will be talking about the implications of Schrems 2 later on. Will I be talking about Brexit? Yes, but I will try not to laugh as I do so. One of the key things we talk about is those elements as we go through. So this Pink Floyd album cover slide belies my age, belies my musical taste, and that is actually personal data about me that you're all now aware of. You know that I'm a big Pink Floyd fan, and I gladly rip off good album covers at the drop of a hat. So some very simple data protection basics we're going to talk about first. I'm going to glance over and bounce off some of these slides because you'll be getting a PDF of this entire presentation later on as part of the follow-up from Black Knight. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on these. You'll be able to read the text and I'll just talk through some of the concepts. But it's important to understand some of the basic rules, some of the basic terminology, so you know what your role is in the game, what your role is in the process. So some key terms you're going to see when you're reading through stuff about data protection, these terms: data controller, data processor, joint controller, and what processing is. So a data controller is an organization or individuals who are defining the means and purposes for processing data. So what that means is if you're making the decisions and deciding what's going to happen and how it's going to happen, if you're choosing the tools and platforms and technologies that are being used in your online store, you're the data controller. If you decided that you're selling t-shirts, even if your web developer says, well, hey, let's sell widgets instead, if you're saying it's t-shirts we're selling t-shirts into this market, you're the controller. Data processor That's an organization or an individual who processes data on behalf of a controller acting on their instructions, but they're not an employee. So this is a contractor. This is someone you might be outsourcing some of the functions to in your business. It could be a virtual assistant who's helping with your business. If they're not on your payroll, they're on a contract and they're a processor. And there's things you need to have in place there. One of the simplest of all is have a contract with that person or with that organization for the services they're providing you. There's specific requirements of what has to be in that contract, but given the amount of stuff I have to cover today, I'm not going to get into the details of that. Joint controllers is where your two controllers are acting together for a common or shared purpose. I'm going to talk about it a little bit of detail later on in the context of plugins and widgets you might put onto your site for social networking services and things like that. They can raise some complications that you need to be aware of, so you've got everything in place around that. And finally, there's the definition of processing. There's a lovely, very long, very lawyer definition in the legislation, but I simplify it. It's doing stuff with data. In fact, it goes even further than that. It's like the old Roman Catholic definition of sin. If you're thinking about doing stuff with data, you're probably at the point where you're starting to begin the process of processing data. So as soon as you start thinking about these things, you have to start thinking about what the role you're playing in the process is, what type of data you're going to be processing about people, and how you're going to be doing that. And that then feeds into your obligations and things you need to be doing from a data protection perspective. Now, this slide is the one-slide summary of GDPR. We've been using this for about, is data only digital data? No, data includes physical data as well, hard copy records, as long as they're in what's called a relevant filing system. So if you've captured the hard copy records with some sort of indexing on them so that a person with common wit and basic understanding of the alphabet or numbers will be able to look up that record and find it, then that constitutes personal data within the context of data protection law as well. It's not just electronic data. In terms of the GDPR, there are 7 core principles. You have to process data lawfully, fairly, transparently. There's a limit, there's purpose limitation, so you have to be clear what is the purpose you're processing the data for, and you need to stick within that purpose. Data minimization means you need to only ask people for the information that is necessary for the purpose that you have. So again, thinking about what you need to ask people, what data you need to capture, and understanding why you have it is a very, very important part of setting up your online business and setting up your online store. So why do you need to ask people what country they're in? Why do you need to ask people their address? Well, if you're shipping a physical product, that's very clear. It's part of your, the purpose is to ship the goods, and you need to have a full address to do that. You need to have an accurate address to do that. So that's where the accuracy principle comes in. And within that, if data about people is wrong, you have to have a way that they can let you know that, and that you can then correct that and change that and update that information. Because again, you don't want someone's orders going to the wrong address. You don't want emails going to the wrong recipient. Storage limitation means keeping data only for as long as you need it for the purpose for which you got it. And that means thinking about what types of data you have, where it's being stored, where it's being kept, and how long you need to have it for. So if you're in an online store, do you need to keep details of orders, and how long would you need to keep them for? And having a plan around that so that you can get rid of information when you don't need it anymore, rather than having lots of stuff sitting on the back end of your web store, on the back end of your WordPress site, or whatever technology you're using. That becomes a risk that increases the risk profile of your business if something bad happens. And the bad happening thing is where we talk about integrity and confidentiality. That's where you have to keep data safe and secure. That's to make sure that you have taken appropriate steps to prevent unauthorized access to, alteration of, or deletion of data. And that you're keeping it safe and secure and confidential. And again, one of the best ways of keeping data safe is by not having it in the first place, which brings us back to the storage limitation principle, and the other principles then all tied together under that. The accountability principle is a new kid on the block in data protection land. And what this basically means is you need to have in your organization, whatever structure your team is, whether you're a one-man band or 20 people or 100 people, you have to have very clear structures in place about who's responsible for what when it comes to the data, being very clear about where the data is, who has access to it, why they have access to it, and who is able to make decisions around changing that data or making changes to how data is processed. That includes how you manage subcontractors and suppliers who might be using data on your behalf. So it brings us back to the question of contracts and controls, which means over here we have this explicit focus on governance in the legislation. And that's around making sure you've got documentation for your controls. You don't have to have a data protection officer. There are certain circumstances where it is mandatory, but it's not required for organizations. But there is certain documentation that you need to keep about the type of data you're processing and why you're processing it. And the controls you have in place over processing data, you'll need to be able to show they're actually working. So this isn't a case of writing some policies and sticking them on a shelf. They have to become part of how you do business. That's part of a risk-based approach to this whole world, where you're trying to manage the risks to individuals and the risks to your organization and achieve your objectives in terms of processing data. So think about privacy by design and privacy by default. Down here, there's the issues of people's rights. There are stricter rules around consent, and people have rights. They can ask you for a copy of their data. They can ask to have data erased in certain circumstances. They can ask you not to process data about them in certain circumstances, and they can opt out of certain processing under certain circumstances. And it's about thinking about how you'll handle those things in advance is one of the most important steps when you're putting together your online store, when you're looking at how you're going to integrate your online business with the rest of your business. If someone sends you a subject access request, how is that going to get handled? Do you know where your data is so you can do that within 30 days you have to respond to it? Also, if you're providing services to an organization, if you're acting as a data processor, it's important to bear in mind that if you are just defining the purposes for processing, you could be acted against and enforced against as if you were a data controller in your own right, which is a big change compared to the previous legislation. So it's important to be clear as part of your governance about who's doing what when, who's making the decisions. So we always tell service providers we work with who are providing services to organizations who are data processors, we always say suggest, recommend, but always ask the client to sign off on the decision. Don't make the decision yourself. I'm not going to spend time talking about the penalties today because penalties are overblown. The headlines are 4% of global turnover, yada, yada, yada. The biggest impact you're going to have if you have a problem from a data protection perspective, if you fall foul of the rules and that you come on the radar of the Data Protection Commission, is that it sucks time out of your business dealing with their questions. And one of the most powerful sanctions they have is to order you to stop doing the thing that you're doing, or to order you to make changes to how you're doing things in a time frame that they set. So ignoring the high profile focus on penalties, the biggest emphasis for businesses that the DPC will have is actually directing you to make changes and to stop doing things. A recent example of that was back in February when Facebook were about to roll out their online dating platform in time for Valentine's Day. And because they didn't have a data protection impact assessment done, the Data Protection Commissioner indicated that they will be displeased if the product was rolled out in Europe, and Facebook as a result pulled their dating app at the last minute in order to avoid having a formal enforcement action taken against them by the Data Protection Commissioner. Well, this is all about balancing risk. It's all about building trust. These principles are a foundation for trust between you and your customers. So they're not barriers to doing business. They're not things that are going to get in the way of you doing things, but they are, in certain circumstances, the entry point and the table stakes for playing the game. And it's been understanding how to play the game that is the important thing. Once you understand the rules, like with all games, you know what the rules are, you can play within them very, very easily. The challenges and problems often arise where people don't know the rules and are suddenly surprised by them, or they know the rules and just disagree with them and don't want to do them. Unfortunately, that's why they're called laws. You do have to work within those. But again, because GDPR is a risk-based framework, there is a degree of wriggle room that you can operate within in certain areas. So the key issues you need to deal with are, do you know what data you're processing about people? Do you know how you're processing it? And then write all that down. Okay? In GDPR, there's a thing called the Register of Processing Activities under Article 30. Some people say that small businesses don't need to do this, that it's only for organizations that are more than 250 people. Technically, that's buried in what's called a recital in the legislation. It's kind of the guidance. It's the thinking behind the meat of the legislation. And and it's an artifact from an early draft. The guidance from all of the regulators is that for organizations of all sizes, in order for you to understand what you're doing with data, in order for you to be able to show that you are complying with your obligations in terms of transparency, in terms of telling people what you're doing with their data, in order for you to know how to comply with a subject access request or other requests you might get from an individual in relation to their data, in order to understand your obligations from a security point of view, knowing where your data is, what data you have, and what you're doing with it is something that's fundamental. And the best thing to do with all that is to write it down. And when you've written all those sorts of things down, you suddenly find yourself in a position where you have a thing you can give to other members of your team, or you can share with your development partners, or you can share with suppliers, or you can share with contractors in relation to understanding your business. And it becomes a very useful tool then just for you to know where everything is, in the same way as in a physical warehouse, you know where things are put away. The registry of processing activities is in effect your inventory for what's in your data warehouse as an organization. You need to make sure your controls are defined. They can be relative to the size and scale of your organization. You don't need to boil the ocean. Everything in data protection is around the level of risk to individuals and the complexity of processing and the type of data you're handling. So again, if you're doing very simple, straightforward stuff, the obligations around what you need to put in place are relatively straightforward and simple. But if you're involved in selling complex medical products, for example, or if you're capturing information about people's health as part of signing up for a service through your online store, well, then your controls are going to be much higher. Okay, comment there from Catherine. I actually have to disagree with you on that one. I deal with about 20 data breaches a month on behalf of organizations, and there is a comment you made there in terms of data breach notification. We'll talk about that later on. I'm going to park that in terms of what the requirement is. Data Protection Commissioner, my experience is that they are very forthright in dealing with data security issues, and they've gotten an awful lot more proactive on those issues. And again, under historic legislation, there were some gaps. Now the gaps are no longer there. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Again, it's not in the core of what we're talking about, but I'll make reference to it. So your registered processing activities. It's a list of what you do with data and why. It's a record of who uses it and who can access it, and a record of where it's kept. So this is an example of one we have from actually part of my own registered processing activities. So one of our processes, registering people for webinars. We have what the purpose is, why we're processing the data, what the data is itself, a list of webinar registrations, the business area in the company, the performances. That tells me who is responsible for this in the organization, who's giving us the data and where it's kept, and the categories of data, subject, etc. So again, it doesn't have to be hugely complicated, but it's just writing down what things are so you have a record of what it is you're doing, so that you're not surprised when you suddenly find that you got functionality on your website you didn't know about. The key thing with your registered processing activities, I call it the Tom Cruise effect. When Tom Cruise asks in the movie Minority Report, where is my Minority Report? If he'd done a registered processing activities, he would be able to look down through the process for minority reporting, and he would be able to look across the registered processing activities to find that the Minority Report is kept in a SharePoint repository or a Google Drive in his organization, and he needs to ask the head of minority reporting for a copy. And really, if he'd done his registered processing activities, life would have been an awful lot easier for him. And that's what this is about, is writing down what you're doing with your data, being clear where it is and what to do with it. And that makes life an awful lot easier. In terms of security, the minimum things you should do for security in your online store, appropriate controls to prevent unauthorized access, alteration or deletion of records, also accidental loss or deletion of records, things to ensure you can recover and restore data if something bad happens, and then being able to demonstrate that you've got those controls in place and that you're testing them and improving them as required. So that's both technology things you need to do, so simple things like backups, implementing a web application firewall in your online store, making sure that you have appropriate password protocols, password security, two-factor authentication, things like that to prevent bad things happening, and then having processes to recover data and respond to an incident and then putting in place things to test and improve and show that you're doing those things. So again, I've had the experience of one of my first books, hard drive failed 2 days before it was due to go to the publisher. I thought I had backups. When I went to have a look, the backups were 3 weeks old. And as a result, I had to spend an Easter bank holiday weekend writing an entire book from scratch, which is not fun. And ever since then, I've been paranoid about testing and reviewing backups. So on our Castlebridge website, we've got the standard backup from Black Knight, but also within our WordPress installation, we've got additional backups as well. So I have backups on my backups to make sure that we can recover. And again, we have a schedule for testing recovery of our backups into a staging area on a regular basis. So again, this is to make sure if something bad happens, we minimize our downtime. So how do you prevent it? How do you deal with it? How do you recover it? Now, breach notification and dealing with data security breaches, there are obligations on you once you are capturing personal data about individuals, whether it's online or not, that you have to notify the Data Protection Commission if there is a risk to the rights and freedoms of the individual. So if there's a chance that someone might use that data in a bad way to affect someone. And if there is a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the individual, you have to notify the affected people. Under the Data Protection Act 2018, there are also criminal sanctions for unauthorized access or unauthorized disclosure of personal data by individuals. This is not something which existed prior to 2018. And in relation to comment there in terms of government employees accessing data, historically there have been successful prosecutions taken by the Gardaí of civil servants who have accessed data without authorization. And in the Revenue Commissioners, it's an offence under Section 851A, subsection J of the Tax Consolidation Act for a revenue official or former revenue official or any supplier to the Revenue Commissioners to disclose taxpayer information without authorization. So there are laws there. The Data Protection Commissioner is the first port of call in terms of enforcement. There are criminal sanctions under the Data Protection Act 2018 as well. And they are there and they will be used. Things to look for in terms of setting up your online store. Simple things. We're looking at trust here. So there's the padlock, the SSL padlock there. I speak at a number of events. I actually pulled out of an event a few months ago because the online registration form for the event was not secured, and the event organizer wasn't doing anything about it. For the sake of a few euro, a little bit of time to secure the data that's going from the form back into the website, securing that connection between the browser and the website. It's worth doing that. Because again, it's about building trust. It's a minimum security standard people are expecting to see. If you have an incident, the first thing the Data Protection Commissioner asks you as part of the investigation of a data security breach in the 72 questions you get sent that they look for answers to, they will ask in terms of use of SSL on websites. Also, from a search engine perspective, Google looks for this, and Google has started penalizing sites that are not SSL protected in their search indexing. So if you're looking to optimize your website, this is one of the things to look at from a search engine optimization point of view, as well as everything else. Credit cards, very simply, don't write them down, don't keep them. This isn't data protection, this is PCI DSS, credit card security standard. Using a third-party processor to manage your credit card, to manage your payments, PayPal, Stripe, etc. They're all possibilities, but again, we'll talk about potential implications in terms of cross-border data transfer in a moment. Using your bank's payment platform, Relex, any of those, instead of you copying information down. One thing that I have seen doing reviews and doing audits over the years with clients is people asking for credit card details to be sent by email or requesting by SMS, or asking people to put them in a DM or a private message on a social networking site. Do not do that. That is not a good idea. Have a process where you can send people to a page with a proper link to a proper payment processor so that you can take payment from people quickly and easily and in a secure way. And most importantly, move the heavy lifting of having to keep that data secure away from your environment and into an organization where it's the meat and potatoes of what they do, and that's what you want them to be focusing on. Now, in all of this, it can seem quite complicated and overwhelming. And this is where using a template-driven site builder service like the one Black Knight offers can help you with a lot of those things. Because a lot of these configuration and security things, the basics are dealt with. The technical elements of putting it together safely and securely are dealt with out of the box. There are other things you will need to do from a data protection perspective in terms of telling people what you're doing with their data, in terms of your data protection notice, that you will tell people what you're doing, who you are, what data you're going to ask them for, and what you're going to do with it. In terms of telling people what cookies you're using on the website, that's something that you will need to tell people about yourself, because you may be adding services and features on that aren't part of the core product. But you can build this stuff yourself, or you can work with a supplier who can give you the bones of your shop with many of these things already configured, ready to go. And that's something to look for, because again, it can become slightly overwhelming, and that's where having trusted partners and trusted suppliers becomes very, very useful. Cross-border data transfers is a key thing to watch out for. And this is where choosing your friends and choosing your partners and choosing your suppliers is an important thing. The general rule is you can't transfer data outside the European Economic Area unless you're falling within one of these key categories. I'm not going to drill into the boring details of the legality today. Suffice it to say, unless you are going to a country that has an adequacy decision, now Privacy Shield was an adequacy decision, it's been struck down by the European Court of Justice. So any third party you're using, when you look at their privacy policy now, if they're based outside of the European Union, if they're based in the US, and they say that they transfer data to the United States under Privacy Shield, I'm very, very sorry, that doesn't work anymore, and you need to find another supplier. Stripe has insisted that, in correspondence with me, that everything's fine, and that because they have because the UK's Information Commissioner has said people can continue to use Privacy Shield, they can continue to use Privacy Shield. That's fantastic. The UK's regulator is no longer an EU regulator, and the European Court of Justice is very, very clear. Privacy Shield is gone. Standard contractual clauses are an option for now, but standard contractual clauses in the United States becomes problematic. So question here, does that mean we can't use a US-based IT vendor? It is now problematic. You can use standard contractual clauses technically, possibly for a little while, as long as you do an assessment yourself of where the data is going. So am I saying you can't use Stripe? What I'm saying is the answer I've gotten from Stripe in relation to their cross-border data transfer requires further clarification in this context. I am hoping that the people I've been dealing with are simply ill-informed, but I am continuing to probe that. And this is when you need to do with third parties when these things like this happen. From a Castlebridge perspective, we're looking at switching to an alternative payment processor. We have another payment processor we use for other payment processing with clients on retainer contracts. So we're looking to see can we use them for credit card processing as well. For Stripe, unless they say they're going to use standard contractual clauses, if they're insisting that Privacy Shield is what they're relying on, no, you can't use Stripe, is my statement today. They need to get better lawyers. And that's something that needs to be clarified by Stripe. And I think any of you who are using Stripe, you should write to them and ask. Can you use PayPal? In answer to your question, Katrina, I have not looked at the detailed privacy policy of PayPal yet. We don't use it directly ourselves. Most of our clients don't use it, so I haven't looked at it in detail. PayPal make changes on a regular basis, and I'm not going to give specific advice on specific products today. But these are the sorts of issues you need to be examining when you're using these services, because where the data goes, if it goes out to the European Economic Area, as the data controller, you are responsible for that, wherever that data goes to. Therefore, the contracts and the foundation and agreements you have in place need to be correct. And with cross-border data transfer, there needs to be some consideration about the adequacy of the protections and controls around personal data in the country the data is going to. It's a really complicated area to discuss, and to be honest with you, I can do a week talking about the ins and outs of this. There's lots of other stuff I'd like to cover today in terms of the basics of doing business online. But this is something you need to watch for, and you need to do the due diligence, and you need to ask your supplier. If you're going to use Stripe, PayPal, SumUp, any of these, contact them and ask them what is the basis for transfer of data outside of the European Economic Area if data is transferring. Because the liability, first of all, starts with you as a controller. These providers need to up their game. They will up their game if their customers ask them, because again, it's trust. Can you trust them to be able to give you good answers to the questions? So Privacy Shield is RIP, and standard contractual clauses, it's country by country scrutiny. It depends on the nature of the data. And you need to look at whether additional safeguards can be implemented to make the transfer possible. Again, encryption of data might be one option, etc., etc. It depends on the context, depends on the data. And in terms of payment process, I literally do not have time to talk about the specifics of every single payment processor, so I won't. I'm sorry. If anyone has a specific query, please contact me directly. I'm more than happy to talk to you about that specifically in relation to the specifics of your business. Things get fun when we talk about UK, because it's not just US. The UK has left the European Union as well. Transfers to the UK are technically transfers to a third country. We are currently in a honeymoon period, or a cuddling just after the divorce period. And for transfers to the UK to be legal after the 31st of December, the UK will require an adequacy decision, or you'll have to be relying on standard contractual clauses. This raises a number of challenges, which means you need to be looking at your UK suppliers and providers, particularly if you do things like dropship. If you're using a UK supplier who data is going to, in order for them to be able to ship goods to you or to ship goods on your behalf, you need to be looking at those elements of of your controls and your relationship with your suppliers as well. Okay, so Brexit coming down the pipeline, it is a difficult one for UK-based businesses or anyone doing business with UK-based third parties who are delivering services on your behalf. Another element here is thinking about the customer experience. One of the things I have hated for years is when I deal with companies who ask me to put personal data into a direct message on Twitter or a personal message on another social networking platform. The problem you have there is that data is sitting in the social networking site, in the account of the social networking account. So if that account is hacked, then any data that's in that direct messages there will be visible. Any data that is in the direct messages will be visible to the malicious third party. So you need to think about how you're building your process there. If you're going to engage with customers on social media like that, where you're going to ask them to send you details, either have a process where you rigorously clear down your direct messages very, very quickly once you've taken that query in and dealt with it, or better yet, when you're interacting with a customer, tell them that you'll DM them a link where they can then contact you through your CRM system or through your website, rather than having to put details into another platform that you have to be securing and supporting. It's just something to watch out for, particularly as we've had the recent hack on Twitter. In terms of Brexit and Northern Ireland, yes, Northern Ireland is in the United Kingdom, therefore data transfers to Northern Ireland will require adequacy decision for the UK or model clauses to be in place. One question about US company with website hosted in Ireland, do you need to comply with EU GDPR regulations? If you're a US company with website hosted in the European Union and you are engaged in processing where you're actively targeting people in the European Union for sales, or you are profiling data of people in the European Union, the answer to the question is yes, you will need to comply with GDPR. Again, I'm looking at the generality here. There's lots of specifics I'm getting in the questions here. Literally, I could talk about this for a week and we would still have questions. So things to talk about there in terms of thinking about your customer experience and how you build trust. Cookies is the next thing we're going to talk about in terms of your online store, what you need to do in that context. What the law actually says. Now, I've seen an awful lot of nonsense and guff out there in the wild about what the requirement is for cookies. I wrote the guidance on cookies for the Direct Marketing Association in 2011. And what the law actually says on cookies is that any data read from or written to a device that's connected to a public communications network is a cookie. It's not just text files, it's pixels, that are written by social networks or by your advertising tracking. It would be HTML, Canvas, stuff that's written. It could be device fingerprinting data that's being extracted through a website. Anything that allows you to identify the device, that constitutes a cookie. You have to have consent for cookies, unless the cookie is essential for the provision of service, strictly necessary for the provision of services, the way it's phrased in the legislation, or if it's solely used for the purpose of carrying out a transmission of communication over a network. So when you have an SSL cert on your website, when people log in, there'll be a cookie written, a session cookie, and that's going to secure their interaction with you. That's okay. You don't need consent for that. The cookies that are written as people move through your shopping cart, that's okay. You don't need consent for that. And analytics cookies, you need to let people know they're there. And if it's third-party analytics, if Google are using data for their own purposes, you definitely need to have consent for that. And to an extent, trust is about identifying what you need to know and how you need to manage things. And again, we use, at Castlebridge, we use a platform a tool called Matomo for our cookies on the site, for our website statistics. We don't use Google Analytics. That means that we're holding that data ourselves. We still have to tell people we're doing analytics. We still have to let people opt out of analytics, but we have anonymized and truncated the identifiable data, so we're not actually processing personal data of individuals or identifiable data of individuals in that context. There's ways you can do it in terms of your design. But the law says you have to get consent in these contexts. So analytics cookies require consent, and third-party cookies are considered a higher risk by regulators. And consent has to be freely given, informed, specific, and unambiguous. It cannot be bundled for multiple purposes. It cannot be implied. This, if you click on if you come to our site and click through, you're accepting our cookies. That's not compatible. That's not compliant. If you scroll down, you're accepting our cookies. No, that doesn't work either. There has to be an actual clear and deliberative act on the part of the person to say, I'm happy to accept these cookies. And you can't have pre-tick boxes. What you need to do, know what cookies you have on a site or an app, be able to tell cookies what you're using and why. You don't need, you can't require cookies to be written in order for people to see the information about the cookies you're writing. So you have to make sure that any site, any page on your site where you're telling people that information, you need to be keeping cookies there to an absolute minimum, to only those that are necessary. You have to give people a mechanism to be informed, and you have to be able to record their preference. The pop-up has to actually give people a choice. They need to be able to see what that choice is. It must be clear and comprehensive information about what your cookies are, so you have to tell people what they are. One thing to watch out for in this is accessibility issues. There is a major vendor selling what's called consent management for cookies. They're one of the big vendors, and I can't use their pop-up because I am colorblind. And the specific shades they have picked in their tool are the shades I cannot see. So you need to be thinking about things like that, and that's called out by the Data Protection Commissioner in their guidance on cookies that came out in April, is that we need to be thinking about those sorts of issues as well as everything else. Pop-ups have to give a reject all cookies that aren't necessary option, and you can't rely on scrolling down, and also you can't rely on people using their browser settings to tell you what their cookie preferences are, because not all things that fall within the definition of a cookie are actually caught by browser settings, and you don't want people to be having to, the browser settings are a nuke 'em all level of protection. People need to be able to have choice in the context of different services and different websites they go to. And also people have to be able to change their mind about what they're doing with cookies. So here's some common issues. This one is one of the vendors again. The shade of green, there's a shade of orange and a shade of green there that against the gray I can't see. Difficult for me to show you that in a static image. Also, it's unclear what the setting means because there's no label that tells you whether it's on or off. This is from a very well-known retailer, and this is the accept or close. No, that's not legal. This is one from another retailer where there actually isn't any option to opt out of these cookies. It's telling you they're there, it's telling you they're always active, but there's no button that lets me turn those off. And this is from a well-known telecommunications company where they have bundled consent, and the consent is being implied from the use of the site. This is also not legal. So these are examples of things you can't do. Okay, what you can do is be upfront with people saying, here are the cookies we use, and here's how you can choose to opt out of them. You can reject them all, you can accept just the necessary, you reject all but the ones that are absolutely essential, or you can tell us specific things you want us to do or not do. And there's various tools available, some free, some paid for, many of them doing quite a good job, some of them not as good as others. Another thing to wonder about is, are you in business with Facebook? This is a question of joint controllers. It's not just Facebook, it's any of these plugins or widgets you're putting on your site. So you put a Facebook like button, you put a tweet this button, a social sharing button. You have kittenhug.com being your website, all these suppliers are there. You've got your purposes as the owner of KittenHug, and the widget suppliers may be taking data for their own purposes as well. Once they're taking data for their own purposes as well, for example, in Google's case, it's or in Facebook's case, it's to feed their advertising engine. Then you've got two purposes where there's a common overlap in terms of presenting the information to the customer. And from a legal perspective, KittenHug is a controller for the stuff that goes on their site. Facebook and the widget companies are controllers for their stuff. They share processing. So KittenHug has to tell people who are coming to their site about what's going on with the third party, saying that you use these services, and as a result, data is transferred, and refer people to the Facebook privacy policy. Also, you will need to go into your Facebook or Google or whatever widget it is, and scroll down through the settings in the admin console and find the bit that says joint controller agreement, and make sure you read that and you've ticked that so that you've got the contract in place with them, so at least you can show the paperwork. Electronic marketing. Very simple. People get these wrong all the time though. Business to consumer requires consent in almost all circumstances. If you're sending email, it requires consent unless you've captured the data during the course of a sale within the previous 12 months. And at the time the person bought the thing, they were given an option to opt out. That doesn't mean that people who have gone onto a website to inquire about a product or look at a product, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a sale. The legislation is quite clear that it's in the context of a sale, not just a general inquiry. Definition of electronic mail can include over-the-top messaging services like WhatsApp and direct messages on Twitter or social media platforms. You have to identify who the sender is, and you have to give people a valid mechanism to opt out. People have to be able to say, I don't want to receive this anymore. And these are all things that people fall down on. Either they don't remember the 12-month rule for people who they've dealt with in the past, or they don't provide an opt-out, things like that. For calls, if you're phoning a landline, you have to clash with the National Directory database, and also you have to respect any request not to be contacted that you've gotten from the person you're phoning. If you're calling a mobile, you have to have opt-in consent if it's business to consumer. Okay, so you have to make sure that people know who they are dealing with as well. And the key thing is, if you're phoning mobiles, you have to make sure you're asking for consent. Now, if you only have one telephone number field on your website, you have no way of distinguishing between landline and mobile. And I worked in telco for more years than I care to remember. In terms of that, you need to be clear that if you can't distinguish between the two, you need to make a decision. Are you going with just opt-in? And I'd always recommend going with just opt-in for all of your marketing on a business to consumer context, because it is going to help you build trust. It also means that you can avoid the, when did I opt in to do this? When did I give you my permission? Because you've got a record of that and you can show it to people, which is a very important thing to be able to do. In terms of contacting customers who you haven't dealt with in a long time, that brings us back to the storage limitation purpose from a data protection perspective. If you haven't dealt with them in a long time, why do you still have the data? And you might want to look at why you were keeping that data, because anything over 7 years, you're really getting into a difficult territory in terms of why you kept that data if you hadn't maintained the relationship with the customer. So e-receipts is something we see a lot of. Really, there's two purposes there. If you're sending someone a receipt electronically, that's a different purpose to the marketing purpose. Marketing requires consent, the receipt doesn't. Okay, business to business. Let's skip over that. I'm going backwards, sorry, excuse me. So business to business, you need to obtain the data fairly and accurately and transparently. You can communicate to people on an opt-out basis if it is relevant to the commercial context in which they gave you their data. Mobile calls require consent. So people have to have said, you can phone my mobile. They have to give you their business card. They have to give you the data. You can't just acquire it from somewhere else. It's a tricky one. Strictly speaking, in the legislation, you need to have consent for mobile calls, full stop. There is no business-to-business exemption in the legislation. Landline, opt-out basis applies as before. But again, you have to clash with the National Directory Database, which you can buy from Aircom. I'm going to skip over this very quickly. This isn't all doom and gloom about data protection. There are other things you can do with data from a strategic perspective. Less than 3% of organizations have data that meets basic data quality standards. Poor quality data costs between 10 and 35% of turnover. So think about your data, not just as I'm setting up a website, I'm going to take in orders, but what is the data you're capturing? What are you going to use it for? What do you need to know in order to be able to do things? You register your processing activities is useful in this regard because it helps you identify what are the most important processes you have that are making you money, that are contributing to your business. What data do you need to have about people or other things to make those processes work? Not just your product data, not just customer data, but product data, and also your content. Search engine optimization is a data quality thing. But whether you can use your data effectively for search engines, search engine optimization. And for your product data, this is from a couple of years ago. This is an Amazon search for Peter Rabbit. When I was looking for a gift for the firstborn child of a friend of mine. And because of the way the data was classified and categorized by Amazon in the database at the time, things appeared on the screen that you would not want to have to explain to a child. Data is your asset. In an online business, it's your salesperson, it's your product, and it's your brand. Getting data protection basics right are the table stakes. It's the first step on building your trust story with your customers. Whether people can find products easily on your website, whether you're selling things they want, that's also part of your brand. Poor quality data, you can miss orders, you can lose orders, you can piss off customers, you can piss off staff. And it's all part of the same thing, thinking about data as an asset. And I won't dwell on this. Okay, I just skipped too fast over the last slide, so you just stuck in my face. I have a checklist at the end there of things you need to think about for an online business. Does anyone have any questions at this stage? I've touched on a lot of questions that have come through on the chat. There is a lot of them. There are ones I'm just not going to be able to answer today, guys, unfortunately. If all the data is anonymized, is third-party collection allowed? First of all, are you sure it's anonymized is what I would say on that. And if it's anonymized, what were you using it for and who's the third party? But the key thing is anonymizing data is not the same as stripping off all the names and addresses and email addresses. If you can identify the person from the data on its own or combining with other data, they can be singled out. That is not anonymized data. So that's one of the key challenges. Okay, any other questions?
Just going to hop in there. Daragh.
Yeah, Chloe.
Thanks so much for that. That was brilliant. You've really covered off everybody's questions, I think. I know some of them are a bit tricky and specific to each individual or each business, I suppose, is kind of the hard part of this. It's not a one answer fits all.
It's difficult to give a one size fits all answer on a webinar like this. Again, I'm going to be blunt. I'm not insured to give answers to direct questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I suppose if anybody does want to reach out to you directly, do you have an email address maybe or something?
Yeah, you can contact me through castlebridge.ie. The contact form there, castlebridge.ie/become-a-client. And you can put the specifics of your question there. It'll go to the relevant member of the team and we'll follow up with you on that. And again, in terms of what I would say is it's important to look at who your partners are when you're launching an online store. You can build it yourself, or you can work with something that has a lot of the heavy lifting done off the shelf for you in terms of security, in terms of the basics of the technology end of running your site. Yeah. But it's your business, it's your brand. How you go about explaining what you're doing with people's data is actually one way you can really put your own mark on things rather than using cookie cutter templates that every other online shop has the exact same thing of. Yeah,
and as you said, I think you were talking earlier today, kind of, it's like almost when you rent out a space. I think that was a good analogy you used.
Basically, if you're using a product to host your online store, it's like renting the shop in your local shopping mall or shopping precinct. The fixtures and fittings you put into that to make the place yours are your approach to your privacy statement, your approach to how you communicate what you're doing with cookies, and how you build that trust with your customer.
And really, in the long run, then it pays off because your customer will trust you and they know that you're a legitimate business and you're doing things correctly and handling personal information and whatever else it may be.
The research on this, Chloe, is interesting because it's with larger organizations, but it's things like sales cycle, how fast it is for people will make a decision, whether people trust you and whether they can find answers to questions. It reduces the sales cycle by up to 42% if people have good data protection practices.
That's cool.
And it's all about going to the shop you trust. Same way as if you're going down the high street, do you go to the shop that's broken down with the windows dirty, where the owner swears to the children, or do you go to the shop that's bright and shiny and everyone's welcome and everything's easy to find?
Yeah, it's all about transparency, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's completely it, Chloe. It's all about transparency and making it easy for your customers to find out what you're going to do with their data, but also not just personal data. If you've got product data, making it easy for people to find what they're looking for on your website. That's a data issue. Once you're putting stuff into a content management system, it's all about data. Like we're doing a project at the moment with our own internal e-learning system we're building for clients. And we're doing an awful lot of work on building the data catalog for our education products so that clients can find stuff quickly and easily.
Yeah.
And we're having to eat our own dog food on that one. It's very tasty.
A good use case.
Yeah, and it's all hosted on Black Knight.
Good to hear. In the EU, might I add.
Indeed.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time there, Daragh, so I'm going to wrap it up if that's okay. Just thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule today. We really appreciate it. And I know all of the attendees have found everything very useful. And as you said there, you can get all the info on your website, castlebridge.ie, and there's contact forms and stuff there that people can reach out if they have any questions.
Yeah, I would give an email address, but I'm going to be very blunt. I get about 3,000 emails a week.
Yeah, no, your team is there and they can help you.
The team is there to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And same goes for ourselves. Our team are online. I know Daragh is the same as us. We're all working remotely, but we are actually open despite everybody thinking that we might not be. So we're fully operational, both of us. If anybody has any questions for the Black Knight team, the usual ways you all can reach out. Visit blackknight.com, give us a shout on phone or email. Daragh, thank you so much for your time today.
You're well welcome, Chloe. Thanks a lot, everybody.